Greetings to all. Welcome to CEC lecture. The topic of discussion for the lecture is United Nations Environment Programme, its functions and objectives. Dear learners, in this lecture we shall explain and try to understand functions and objectives of UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme. In this lecture, we shall discuss important aspects of environmental governance also while trying to understand the role of United Nations Environment Programme. This lecture further shall highlight significant inputs from various reports that have been there by United Nations Environment Programme. To begin with, United Nations Environment Programme, it is the leading authority, environmental authority in the United Nations system. We have often heard that United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, it is the leading environmental authority in United Nations system. Taking things forward, let us first quickly understand the work of United Nations. United Nations as an international world organization officially came into existence on 24th of October 1945. What are the main works of United Nations? We all know that, and let's recall: maintaining international peace and security, protecting human rights, delivering humanitarian aid, supporting sustainable development and climate action, amongst others. We all know that there are important functions that are done by United Nations, and from maintaining international peace and security, protection of human rights, working for sustainable development and climate action are indeed important work that are being done by United Nations in the present times. The United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, as we just said, it is a leading environmental authority in United Nations system. UNEP uses its expertise to strengthen environmental standards and practices while helping implement environmental obligations at the country and the global levels. Trying to understand the mission of UNEP, and for that we take reference to UNEP main website as a source of primary information. That is, UNEP's mission is to provide leadership and encourage partnership in caring for the environment. Now we all know that today environment is a very important global issue. Ecological sustainability, ecological imbalances are often pointed at various global summits also. So UNEP's mission, as we just said, that is to encourage partnership, providing leadership with respect to this crucial aspect of environment, and enabling nations to improve the quality of life without compromising that of future generations. As we just said, that UNEP is leading global environmental authority. So that brings the question, when was it established? It was established on 5th June 1972. I repeat, 5th June 1972. The functions of UNEP, once again taking reference from unep.org, that it sets the environmental agenda. As we all know that today environment is an important subject for global governance. So in order to understand that, one has to factor in the role of UNEP. It sets the global environmental agenda, promotes sustainable development within United Nations systems, and serves as an authoritative advocate for global environment protection. Once again, the functions we have got from unep.org. Moving forward, from important campaigns that we all have seen, from beating pollution, World Environment Day, all of these have been major campaigns by United Nations Environment Programme. The headquarters of UNEP are at Nairobi, Kenya. And yes, in the later part of the lecture, we'll also try to understand the important role played by United Nations Environment Assembly, UNEA. So UNEP's mission, once again reading from epa.gov, its mission is to provide leadership and encourage partnership in caring for the environment by inspiring, informing, enabling nations and people to improve their quality of life without compromising that of future generations. The UNEP, as we try to understand its establishment in 1972, we have to go back to the time to look at the important conference and deliberation that was there. So UNEP was founded as a result of United Nations Conference on the Human Environment 1972. Going further and develop into the important aspects of 1972 United Nations Conference, once again we read it from UN.org sources, that is the 1972 United Nations Conference on Environment was first, that's very important to understand, first world conference to make environment a major issue. Then it is also important that herein, while we try to understand the deliberations of 1972 United Nations Conference on Environment that was held in Stockholm, that is, in this conference, environment was a major issue because herein the participants adopted a series of principles for sound management of the environment. And what were the important principles? For that, for your future research, you must take into account the Stockholm Declaration, and next is Action Plan for the Human Environment and several resolutions. So, two important components here, Stockholm Declaration and then Action Plan for Human Environment and several resolutions. So, 1972 United Nations Conference on the Environment in Stockholm, it was the first world conference. This is very important to factor in. First world conference to make environment a major responsibility. Environment a major responsibility for understanding and for putting forward environmental problems amongst United Nations agencies. Let's try to understand the Stockholm Declaration in detail a bit here, that when we read from the Article 1, when we try to understand the Article 1 of the Stockholm Convention, that is, as set out in the Article 1, the objective of the Stockholm Convention is to protect human health and environment from persistent organic pollutants. And most important, whenever we try to discuss the Stockholm Declaration, it is important to understand that it is the first global cooperation forum mechanism with respect to environmental issues. And this also then becomes very significant because, as you all know, that in international relations, the realist paradigm was most important, and this realist paradigm with statism, self-help, survival gave a lot of priority to the high politics domain. And in this ambit of high politics, environment, ecological issues did not find their due space. But with time, the rational turn within in this rational perspective of realism and neorealism, the reflectivist perspectives try to highlight the individual agency, the human agency, and environmental issues also became very important in the post-Cold War era. So, the Stockholm Declaration, as we are discussing, this has to be seen in that reference, that how it lays the foundation for modern environmental diplomacy, and at the same time the establishment of UNEP also gives a major boost to environmental diplomacy. So, addressing climate change or issues like combating desertification, which are often overseen by other UN organizations, that is UNFCCC and the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, the World Meteorological Organization and UN Environment were established, and then how the World Meteorological Organization and UN Environment established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, in 19 1988. So all of these are very important to understand while understanding the functions of UNEP. Further, there have been important treaties that have been concluded under the aegis of the United Nations Environment Program or UN Environment. What have been there? What have been these? Once again, recalling what we just said, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. It is a scientific intergovernmental body under the auspices of the United Nations. It was first established in 1988 by two United Nations organizations. What were they? World Meteorological Organization and United Nations Environment Program. So IPCC, that is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it is a leading international body for assessment of climate change. IPCC at the same time, it is a key source of scientific information and technical guidance to, that is, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. So therefore, while we understand the role of IPCC, Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement, the functions of UNEP also need to be seen here in that regard. Further, important convention like Convention on Migratory Species or the Bonn Convention or Global Wildlife Conference, it is an international treaty concluded under the aegis of United Nations Environment Program. This convention was signed in 1979. So what you see here is 1972, just 7 years after that, we have an important convention on migratory species, the Bonn Convention, and UNEP played a very important role. So it was signed in 1979 in Bonn, Germany, and it was entered into force in 1983. The Convention on Migratory Species, as we understand, it is the only global and UN-based intergovernmental organization established exclusively for the conservation and management of terrestrial, aquatic, avian, migratory species throughout their range. Further, as we try to understand functions and objectives of United Nations Environment Program, the Global Environment Facility is also very important to be understood. The Global Environment Facility, GEF, it unites 183 countries in partnership with international institutions, civil society organizations, private sector, with respect to the important issue, that is addressing global environmental issues while supporting national sustainable development initiatives. When we talk about the Global Environment Facility, the GEF also serves as the financial mechanism for the following conventions. That is, some of them are Convention on Biodiversity, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. The UN Environment or UNEP, it is one of the several implementing agencies for Global Environment Facility and the multilateral fund for the implementation of the Montreal Protocol. So, member of United Nations Development Group 2, UNEP has registered several successes, and some of the important successes that we can see, the 1987 Montreal Protocol, 2012 Minamata Convention, a treaty to limit toxic mercury. So, as we just said in the beginning of the lecture, that as we try to understand the functions and objectives of UNEP, the role of the United Nations Environment Assembly, UNEA, is also very important, and we will be discussing that now. The United Nations Environment Assembly, abbreviated as UNEA, it is the governing body of the United Nations Environment Program. It is world's highest level decision-making body on the environment. The UNEA, now this assembly meets biennially to set priorities for global environmental policies and develop international environmental law. UNEA was created in June 2012 during the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, also referred as Rio Plus 20. When we try to understand UNEA, United Nations Environment Assembly, it meets once in 2 years to establish priorities for environmental policies and develop international environment law. It was formed in 2012. That's very important to understand. 2002, it was formed in 2012. It is headed by a bureau and its president. The bureau comprises 10 environment ministers of various countries who hold 2 years terms based on geographical rotation. UNEP employs several interlinked sub-programs for action, and this is very important to understand the interlinked sub-programs for action: climate change, chemicals and pollutions action, nature action, science policy, environmental governance, finance and economic transformations, and digital transformations. I repeat that one has to understand the interlinked sub-programs for action: climate change, chemicals and pollutions action, nature action, science policy, environmental governance, finance and economic transformations, and digital transformations. So therefore, when we try to understand the major functions of UNEP, that UNEP has been engaged in developing global conventions on environment and related issues. It also hosts the secretariats of various conventions. What are they? Convention on Biological Diversity, Minamata Convention, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, Basel Convention, Stockholm Convention, Rotterdam Convention, Montreal Protocol, Vienna Convention, Convention on Migratory Species, Tehran Convention, Bamako Convention. Further, UNEP has also published some important reports, and every year these reports give important insights with respect to important issues concerning ecology, with respect to issues concerning climate change and environment. To take this discussion forward, we take reference to emissions gap report, and for the purpose of discussion we will refer to emissions gap report 2021. Now this report was authored by UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center, and in this emissions gap report 2021, that is, the heat is on. That's very important. The heat is on. How the title reflected the important findings in the 12th edition, that is the emissions gap report 2021. Now the emissions gap report, it's an annual series. So that shows that every year through its research, UNEP presents important dynamics to comprehend. So annual series that provides an overview of the difference between where greenhouse emissions are predicted to be in 2030 and where they should be to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So what are the important findings? Let's understand that. So let's take reference to the emissions gap report 2021. The authors UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center. So in this report it was pointed out that new national climate pledges combined with other mitigation measures put the world on track for a global temperature rise of 2.7 degrees Celsius. That's an important number by the end of the century. Further, the report says, and we quote from the report, that is well above the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, and world would lead to catastrophic changes in the Earth's climate. To keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius this century, the aspirational goal of the Paris Agreement, that is, the world needs to halve annual greenhouse gas emissions in the next 8 years. Further, the Global Environment Outlook is often referred to as the UN Environment's flagship environmental assessment, UN Environment's flagship environmental assessment. UN Environment launched the first global environment outlook, that was in the year 1977. Further, the sixth edition of the Global Environment Outlook Report 2019 pointed out some important inputs, and let's take a reference to that in order to not only understand the functions and objectives of UNEP, but also to understand how important ecological issues are now for global governance. The sixth edition of the Global Environment Outlook Report pointed out 2019, that is, as greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise amid an increased risk of droughts, flood, made worse by climbing sea levels, there is a growing political consensus that climate change possesses a future risk to billions. Lacking access to clean drinking water supplies, 1.4 million people die each year from preventable diseases. A quarter of all premature deaths and diseases worldwide are due to man-made pollution and environment damage. Chemicals pumped into sea cause potentially multi-generational adverse health effects. So the report calls for a decrease in greenhouse gas emissions and pesticide use to improve air and water quality. So it is very important to understand the scientific research inputs UNEP's work provides. The United Nations Environment Programme released a report, Making Peace with Nature, and in this report it also highlighting climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, all of them, they add up to self-inflicted planetary emergencies that are closely interconnected and put the well-being of current and future generations at unacceptable risk. The World Environment Day, as we are discussing role and functions of UNEP, we must understand it every year on 5th June, which is the biggest international day for the environment. The World Environment Day is led by UNEP and held annually since 1973. This event has grown to be the largest global platform for environmental outreach, with millions of people from across the world engaging to protect the planet. The World Environment Day for the year 2022 focused on the theme Only One Earth. That was the campaign slogan, with the focus on living sustainably in harmony with nature. World Environment Day 2021 theme was Ecosystem Restoration, a global mission to revive billions of hectares from forests to farmlands. So dear learners, we hope that the lecture on United Nations Environment Programme, functions and objectives presented to you significant inputs to understand the role of UNEP and also understand how important ecological issues are when we understand global governance dynamics. We look forward to positive, encouraging feedback from you all. Thank you very much.